Alright, so in today's video, we're going to go ahead and make a simple bookcase like this one right here. So in today's video, my son's going to help me build a bookcase for his room here. And basically, him and I got into a game called Warhammer, and so we've been building models and playing this game. And this gives us something to do when they're, during the lockdown, which has lasted a year now. But so he needed a place to put books and also the models that he builds to display them. So we wanted to make a simple bookcase. So in this case, I used some plywood that I originally bought for my cabinets. I actually went to Home Depot and purchased about $300, well, yeah, it was $300 worth of wood from Home Depot. And this maple plywood that they had. And their price was exactly the same as the price is over at Lowe's for their maple plywood. And also for now, I purchased Lowe's plywood and I actually went there first, but they were all out of the maple plywood when I went there. So I went over to Home Depot, thought, well, the same price, I'll get it. That was a very bad mistake on my part. Now, the Home Depot plywood, I got it all home and I cut it all up. And there have been pieces back there that have been lined up. You can see that there's some upper cuts there for the upper cabinets. And so I cut out all of my cabinets and started putting them together. And I actually have pieces down back there that I put together that they all did this. They warped like really, really bad within a week after I had the wood. And so I went back to Home Depot and I took them a piece of wood and showed them how it all warped. And I said, look, I ran this all back, but I did cut it all up. And they said, well, because you cut it up, we can't take it back. So I pretty much was stuck with the wood, which, is kind of bad because I don't think it's my fault. I think it's their fault because they buy this plywood and I'm not really a big fan of their plywood. It has maple on the front, and you can see that it has a lot of black spots in there. It's not a very clean maple. It's a very low-grade maple plywood. And the backing material is a different material. It's not really maple. Or it could be. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's a different type of maple. But this thing warps so bad. And the guy said, well, all wood warps. Well, wood does, but we buy plywood because it doesn't warp as much. It does warp some. Now, I have a piece of plywood in my lumber pile there, 4x8 sheet that has been there for a year from Lowe's and has not warped. So I ended up buying some more wood to continue building my cabinets from Lowe's, and none of that has warped yet. So I would not recommend buying any wood from any type of plywood or finished type of wood from Home Depot because I think that they do get their cheapest wood that they possibly can. And this side is almost unusable. I mean, you got this filler here, and it does have a lot of blowouts in the plywood as you're cutting. So it's not, it's a very bad quality wood. So back to why we built the bookcase. So I've been looking for projects to use that wood on that I could pull the warp out of. And the way that I can do that is by making a face frame around the front and nailing it to the face frame and also screwing it all together. And that helps me design a cabinet so I can pull the warp out of it. Such as in this case, I have this centerpiece down there, which is aligned by this center style going down the center here. And then the rail going across here is going to keep this part square. This is screwed down on the tops here to these pieces, which is going to flatten this piece down and keep that square. So I used a lot of, I used all of the wood. Is from the Home Depot stuff that's really warped. And so we had to fight with it a little bit to get it to work, but it actually came out really well. And for the shelves here, I just found the pieces that weren't as warped as much and then cut them down to smaller size shelves. That's why I divided this in half to make it adjustable. And he's going to have books, so I didn't want a really long shelf. But also it gets rid of some of the warp. And so anyway, let's go ahead and watch the video and see how we built it, and I'll come back and explain some of the details I did on this cabinet and why I did them. So my first step is going to be to cut all of the side and top pieces on my table saw to length. And because my table saw sled doesn't really have a long enough fence for that, I have to make each cut individually and mark it with a measuring tape. So I'm real conscious to make sure that these cuts are as accurate as possible. That way all the pieces are the exact same size. So both the top and bottom are the same size, and the sides and the internal divide piece is also the same size. So accuracy is very crucial at this point, making the pieces for the bookcase sides and tops. Now that the sides and tops are finished, the next thing is to drill all the holes into all the side pieces. Now both end pieces, the outside pieces, are going to have holes on the inside on just one side, but the center piece is going to have holes on both sides. Now I use this Rockler jig to do that, and here my son is drilling all of that out. And if you want to see information on this jig, I actually have another video on how to use this jig and place all these holes for the bookcase. I find a jig like this is really the best way to make accurate holes for the adjustable shelves, and this method is actually the simplest way to make adjustable shelves for the bookcase, or for any cabinet for that matter. This quick time lapse shows the assembly of the case, the bookcase itself. We used bar clamps to clamp everything together, then used screws, and to make sure that everything was square, I used the Rockler assembly squares and clamped them in the corners. That way everything lines up perfectly. Now that I have my dimensions, my inside dimensions of the bookcase, I can go ahead and make all of my shelves. So here I'm cutting them to width. I've already cut them to length, and I'm going to make them a little bit shorter than the depth of my bookcase, so that they can go up and down, and if I do need to make some cleats on the back and add a back to this bookcase, I have some room for that. Now with the measurements from my bookcase carcass, I can go ahead and start cutting the face frames, and all the face frames are going to be 1.5 inches wide, and these are what's going to basically be used to keep all of the plywood square, that warped plywood that I have. So here I'm cutting them all to width, and then I will use the actual bookcase to determine what the length will be on them. On both the top and bottom rails for the cabinet face frame, I'm going to make a 45-degree cut, so this has to extend a little bit past the cabinet itself. So what I'm doing here is I'm cutting the 45 on one side, which I will use as a measurement, and line that up with one side of the bookcase. Then on the other side I will make my mark to cut the second 45 degree. That way this will be the exact size that I need to wrap the piece around both the top and bottom to add that finished piece that will cover the end grain of the plywood on the sides of the bookcase. And also it will form my locking mechanism for adding a second cabinet on top to expand the bookcase. Now once I have these rails lined up, I'm going to go ahead and clamp them to the cabinet, and I'm going to check on the other side that you don't see here. That's what I'm doing now, is checking on the other side to make sure that 45 lines up with the edge of the cabinet. Once I'm sure that that has happened, I'm going to come back over to this side and scribe a line on the inside here, and that's where the start of my 45 will be, so that I can create a 45 joint on the outside there and have a nice smooth joint leading to my pieces on towards the back. Now both the bottom and top are done the exact same way. Here I'm working on the bottom. Now it's back to the table saw, and I'm going to make the second 45-degree cuts, and again I have my scribe lines there, so I have to be as accurate as possible on these measurements and use my scribe line to cut the 45s. And you can see here I'm making some adjustments as I get the blade lined up perfectly, because if I remove the scribe mark, that means that this 45 will be on the exact edge of that bookcase. I am making these 45-degree cuts on the trim pieces so that I can just do the straight cut to my finished length once I have them marked. Here I'm setting my stop to the length that I need for the stiles, the 3 stiles that are going to go vertically on the bookcase. Now that I have both my top and bottom rails set, I know the exact dimension, and I actually walked back there to measure that just to make sure. And once that's set up, I can make all 3 of my cuts, and these are all going to be exactly the same thanks to that stop block. Now here I'm going to go ahead and use the cabinet to measure those trim pieces that are going to go along the side there. And you see that I've already cut the 45 degree. I just line that up with the piece, the front piece, and then I just mark on the back there, and I can make just a nice simple straight cut on that. This makes it much easier than trying to do it at the 45 degree end. Now we can start assembling the face frame. We're actually going to do it on the cabinet because we're using this face frame to square up that crooked plywood. We're going to have to make some adjustments. So each piece is going to get glued onto the cabinet individually. Now this makes it a little bit of a challenge because we do want the rails and the stiles to have a nice tight fit on there. So you're going to see that we're eventually going to get the base rail down and then nail that in so that it squares up the plywood. Then we're going to use the stiles and clamp them in so that they put pressure down onto that bottom rail so that I get a nice tight fit on there, so that when I add the glue to both the back and the bottom of the stiles, that will give me a nice finished look and a nice tight joint. But as you can see here, we really had to adjust the plywood because there is some work was taken out on the assembly, but there's still some left there, and we're adjusting that out using that 1.5" maple hardwood to line up everything square. Now at this point we're going to start assembling our stiles onto the face of the cabinet. And again, while I want to use them to make sure that that plywood stays straight, I also want to get a nice tight joint between the top and bottom part of the stiles into the rails. And you could probably assemble this rail separately and then put it on there and try to square it all up, but I thought that it would be easier to do it this way, and it actually was a little bit easier to do this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue the stiles down to the cabinet and then to the bottom rail, and just use the top rail has a pressure point when we clamp it up to push that stile into the bottom rail. And you'll see in a little bit here that we will actually put the top rail on at the end. So right now I'm just gluing all the stiles into the bottom rail and onto the bookcase itself. Once everything is nailed down to the bookcase and all the clamps are set in place, I'm going to go ahead and let this dry and come back to it in about an hour. Alright, so while the bookcase is drying, I'm taking this time to add the banding to all of my shelves. Now there were 4 shelves in total, but I'm just showing you how I band the one shelf here. If you want more information on banding, I do have a video available for that. It'll be up in the upper left corner here. But it's just a simple process of ironing it down, trimming it up, and then going on to the next side, ironing it down, trimming it up, and moving on each way. So the main thing to remember about banding is to get the iron nice and hot and make sure that it has a nice firm seal so that it doesn't come up afterwards. And you definitely want to sand it down so that there's no spots for it to grab onto. Now at times you're going to see me use a rag to wipe it down, and that's just to cool it off and make sure that the pressure is there as the glue dries when it cools off, and make sure that the adhesion is very good on it. During that downtime I also cut the toe kicks out. I made them from 2.5" piece of plywood, and again this plywood is kind of warped, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some pocket holes and screw that in, and that's going to help me align and keep this toe kick squared up with the cabinet. So I didn't show you cutting out the toe kick, it's just ripping them to the width and then cutting them to length and putting a 45-degree angle on them. But here I just use my pocket hole jig to make all the holes that I need, and next I'm going to screw that in, screw and glue it into the bottom of the bookcase. Now with all of my holes drilled into the back of the toe kick, I'm going to start gluing this onto the bottom and screwing it in. Now you can see that I have to use some pressure to straighten it out. I'm using the front of the cabinet's face frame to line this up to make sure that the toe kick stays straight and to get out as much of the warp as possible. And the nice thing about it is the angle of these hidden screws going in at that angle help bring that toe kick closer to the face frame and help reduce that warp also. Now it's not warped so bad that you can't press it out, but using the screws and the glue, this method is going to guarantee that that warp stays out of that toe kick for the life of the bookcase. Now at the end here, you're going to see that I'm going to use a clamp to go across the toe kick just to make sure that the 45-degree angle is nice and as a nice tight fit, and so that when the glue dries, there's a nice tight joint on the 45-degree angle. Okay, so that's how everything got assembled. My son ended up sanding it all down. I gave him the crappy job of sanding it, but he did an excellent job on that, and we got this all together. Now, as you saw, I used screws on the top here, and this helps hold it down. Now, originally, and as most of you who've watched this channel before, my plans generally are I take a size that I need, which I measured the distance that I needed for this and the height, and I just go ahead and cut the pieces, make my carcass, and then I go ahead and start making the face frame and just pretty much putting it together on the fly. And doing stuff, you do make mistakes, and but you sort of learn to adjust for that. But in this case, what I want to do is I wanted to make this stackable so that eventually he could use this as a wall unit if he wanted to. And so what I did was I was going to actually have this top piece was going to be flush to this piece here from the bottom. So that way it'd have a 3/4 inch gap on top. It'd sort of have this rim across the top here, so that when I made the other cabinet, it could just slide down into it. But then I realized that I would have to put a piece on the bottom of that cabinet that would extend down below. So it'd have to be like an 1.5 inch wide piece. So instead what we did is, I don't know how long before we make another one. So I made this a flat top, and then when we go to make the other cabinet, we'll do the base just like we did this base, where we have 3/4 inch reveal on the bottom, and we'll have that on the upper cabinet, and I'll just attach a piece that's cut the same size as this top piece onto the top here, and that way it will slide over and lock right into it and make it a nice solid bookcase, which go as far up to the ceiling as you want, or as high as you want. So that's the idea. I left the back open because we may want to put cleats back here to attach it to a wall eventually at some point. Right now we don't need to because it's smaller, but we may end up doing that. You saw how we assembled the adjustable shelves. I do have a video on how to go ahead and laminate the ends of this with the tape, and if you want to watch that, it's right up here. And then I also have a video that talks about the tool that we use for drilling these holes and how to drill them out and make it easy for you to do for these pin shelves, and that is right up there also. So, like I said, I used the straightest piece, finished up the edges on all these. We made it so that it's adjustable, so that some of these shelves he might need, just only to be that tall. So we made it so that we could make some more shelves and add them in there very easily. But it's just a nice solid little bookcase for use. It's simple to build, really easy. I would say that it could probably take you maybe about a day if you really wanted to do it quickly. It took us about 3 days to do it because we did, he has to work, so we did it when he wasn't working. But yeah, this is how you build a nice simple bookcase for any room. It comes out looking really nice. I like the finishes. I used trim pieces across the top here to come around here and at the bottom, just so that it covers the plywood faces, or plywood edges, I should say. And so that way you have a finished edge all around it. You don't really see the plywood from the front at all. Everything is finished. Everything has a nice look to it. And this is 1.25 inch maple, by the way. All these trim pieces are 1.5 inch maple, and has all of these too. And you saw how I put them on the cabinet, the way that we would attach them down so that we can make sure that everything was square and squared up and going down the side. And then I put a miter cut across here, which extended out. So anyway, I appreciate you watching this far. If you would, please give the video a like. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you have to say, or if you have projects that you build that are similar to this. I do answer all the comments. I try to. Do subscribe if you want to see the videos that are coming up. I will have a video released here next week on how we're going to finish this particular bookcase. So you might want to watch that. Other than that, thanks a lot for joining in and tuning in, and hopefully you'll be here on the next video.